Hello, everyone. Welcome to Christian's Questions, a project of the New Tolerance campaign. Today, I have another great guest with me, Adam Coleman. Adam Coleman is the author of Black Victim to Black Victor. He is an op-ed writer. He is a public speaker. He is the host of the Breaking Bread video series and the founder of Wrongspeak Publishing. He is also a columnist for Human Events and a frequent contributor to places like the New York Post. And so today we're going to be talking about a bunch of topics, race, so on and so forth. And so, Adam, let me just thank you so much for being here with us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
Absolutely. So let me just ask you the first question. And that's tell us about Wrongspeak, because that's your organization. Tell us about its mission, tell us about how it's grown, and tell us about the idea that created the kind of blueprint for it.
Yeah, Wrongspeak initially started as while I was writing the book, I created it as like a kind of like a solo blogging platform for me to talk about something that wasn't related to the book. Um, but once the book was published, I realized that I wanted it to be an outlet for other people and not myself. So over time, I just started inviting people, regular people. If I saw something on Twitter and they had a story, I asked them to write an article. And these are people who are just like, all they did was put out like a thread or something like that, or a tweet. And so for many of them, I just encourage them to write an article so it can help to spread what they're saying. And it just became very cathartic for many people. And so it just gave people a chance to be heard. And over time, I basically made it to a point where I don't write for Wrongspeak anymore. We're able to get 90+% submissions. We have a few columnists now, but yeah, for the most part, it's just people who are aspiring writers or people who have something to say. Um, they come from all over the place. It's international. So it's been an interesting project. It's gotten some of the writers opportunities to write for other publications as well. I've had some editors reach out to me asking to connect to certain writers a few times. So it's been a little bit of a springboard opportunity. And then I want to say it was about a year ago, we started diving into book publishing, which is still a little bit of an experiment to try and figure out how we can make it work, what's the best way to go about it, but it's with the same idea in mind, give people opportunity to be heard. Um, and, especially for me, coming as someone with no public platform, um, and building myself up, what I'm offering is kind of like some mentorship and guidance, just general advice, and friendship for people who are involved and see if I can help them repeat what I experience.
That's absolutely beautiful. And that's a good service as well. So
Yeah.
kudos on you for doing that. So tell me, how did you get involved on writing about issues of race and politics? What was the origin point for you in that kind of activity?
Um, my book stemmed from George Floyd. Well, a combination of George Floyd and the pandemic, because it felt like you weren't allowed to talk about certain things or ask certain questions. And there was this weird narrative that was going around, but you weren't allowed to question it. Given the idea, like a lot of people really think this thing, which I thought was weird. And then finding out that I'm not alone in seeing like, actually, this is ridiculous. And a lot of people don't agree with this stance. Um, so, for me, writing the book was an opportunity to express myself, to create something to dedicate to my son. And, it was just something that I wanted to do. I had no idea what was going to come from it. I really didn't have any expectations. I still don't have expectations for it. But I sell copies every week. Um, and I don't market it as much. And that just tells you like, it shows that if you do something that you're really passionate about and you put it out there, um, other people will notice it too, and word of mouth and spread to others. So, um, I'm very thankful for the success it's had. I've told people, and I'm dead serious about it. when I wrote the book, I thought like my family was going to buy it and like, some friends and 10 other people outside of that. Um, so I expected none of everything that came afterwards.
Well, well, that's a very good story of perseverance as well. And
Yeah.
actually, before I get to my next question, I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. You know, we've both witnessed the race conversations over the past few years. And one of
Hmm.
the central elements of the left-wing narrative about race is that Black people are perpetually victims or they are more statistically prone to being victims. And
Hmm.
yet, your experience over the past few years, growing a platform by yourself, starting a publishing company by yourself, doing these kinds of things, doesn't this kind of just disprove that Black people are held to this cycle of victimhood and mediocrity and have to be that way? I mean, because
Yeah.
most people would say someone with your kind of success would have done so only because their parents did it or they came from money. But look at you. So why don't
Hmm.
examples like yours cause the leftist narrative to be disbelieved by most people who believe it?
Well, we're inconvenient. Um, and people only highlight things. Well, a lot of people highlight things that affirm what they already believe. It's
Hmm.
hard for people to acknowledge where they might be wrong, especially someone who's highly ideological, like the people we're talking about. Um, and on top of that, I'm a coon to them, so they don't want to highlight me. Um, just in the same way, Ben Carson's a coon, but they completely ignore how he went from a failing student to a highly successful surgeon and one of the best surgeons in the world. So you know, they'll easily discard someone, even if that person used to be a friend, ideologically speaking, at one point. But if that person deviates just slightly, they'll discard them and discredit them. So um, I don't. I mean, obviously, I don't really care. I
Of
don't
course,
really
of
care.
course.
Yeah,
That's a superpower, you know? That's a superpower.
yeah.
Being able not to care. So, speaking about the race conversations from 2020
Mm.
to 2024, how do you think the conversation has evolved? Because we went from talking about critical race theory and people like
Mhm.
Robin DiAngelo and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Kendi being the celebrities, but now it's gone almost always to DEI. How do you think it's changed from what you've seen?
I've seen some good and some bad, and it's bipartisan as far as the good and bad. So from the left, I see I see the far left, the anti-racist, that stuff. I see the trend of going towards the Kendis and all that stuff. I see their influence decreasing in the mainstream. In academia, that's a different story, but in the mainstream, decreasing. Um, I see less and less of the anti-racist. I see the media publications that would platform um, leftists as far as like writers and op-eds and pieces like that. They still exist, but when you have outlets like the Washington Post bringing in the old guard and saying this shit ain't working,
Yep.
they're, that's a sign that like this trend is starting to slow down. Um, I see more pushback about the DEI stuff. Like when it's like legitimate pushback towards it, I see companies starting to roll back on these particular things. So I see that on as far as how it's affecting the left. On the right, I see one, I do see some strength as far as not being afraid to talk about these things. When in the very beginning, everyone was very timid to talk about these things. Um, so I think it's good that they're willing to discuss these things. However, I think that there's an economy that's been built on the political right um, that is very much so outrage oriented, that is very much so taking a legit problem and turning it into the boogeyman. So DEI is a legit problem. It is a legit concern. We can talk about it for days as far as why it is a bad thing on its face. But then it gets perverted into being a weapon that you can throw and label someone just because you don't like them. Um, and it becomes a level of suspicion if the person is black or a woman or whatever, basically anyone who is not a white male in any given position that they believe that a white male would likely be in that position. So like when we discuss the pilots, yes, maybe most of the pilots are typically white male, but it doesn't mean that prior to DEI there weren't black pilots or anything like that. And I've been very concerned about the reaction to the far left being the reaction is to take the extreme opposite position of the far left for the far right. So I've been more so concerned about the constant tit for tat, whereas early on the right has a point. They clearly have a point. But now I just see an economy around the outrage and that point being perverted to the point of people saying, you know what, we're starting to not even believe you because now it sounds like you're crying wolf. Um, and so that's been my concern. And I've been trying in my own way to sound the alarm that this is a failing tactic, but the problem is too many people make money off of this. And quite literally, X or Twitter is built upon paying everyone directly for reactions to things. And so, of course, people are going to be absurd with the type of stuff to get an absurd reaction, and they make more money off of it. So um, that's that's something that I'm really concerned with as far as the actual discussion, because we can't have a discussion if everyone is so out of touch and far-fetched with the statements they make.
Yeah, I think the best way to handle this problem is by virtue of having conversations like this, long form conversations where the person is on video and they have to talk. Because it's very different, the conversation on X versus the
Right.
conversation like this, right? X has its own kind of laws of gravity that allow stupidity and to put it in a certain way to be exemplified. Whereas this kind of format, people aren't as confident or they're not as competent in the real world. So I think this is one of the ways. But I think I absolutely
Exactly.
do share a concern as well. So from your vantage point at this moment, what are the biggest obstacles for a colorblind society in 2024?
Uh, the biggest obstacles. It's kind of similar to what I talked about just before, but a little bit deeper. I guess the biggest obstacle is that there's too much money and not finding a resolution. Um, and I think, you know, we talk about the culture war. Um, I think I've written an article kind of like using an analogy of like of an actual war, like foreign conflicts. And we're like, why do we have troops in these other countries? And and like, okay, well, we go into these countries, but we never leave. And it's like, why? Well, because there's money. There's money there, right? We can hold resources, we just perpetuate the war because someone's making money, contractors are making money, everybody's making money off of war. In much in the same way, everyone's making money off the supposed culture war. Um, and so there is no wanting to resolve the war. There's money in perpetuating the war, or even the idea that there is a culture war is something that I've strayed away from over a period of time. Obviously, like politics and culture have always mixed. But I think people literally take it that we're in a culture war, and that there's only one way to go, and it's either us or them, and everyone who's against us must be destroyed. So that means that if one person says something, that means they're part of the war, so we must destroy them. So, like we saw last week, if a cashier makes some flipping comment online, well, guess what? Get them fired from their job. You know, so it's like it's that kind of overstepping, overreaction. Um, and then when you read the responses from people who are bloodthirsty, in many ways, it's kind of like, well, yes, this is war. It's like this is not war. You're going after grandma in a tough economy. Like
Yeah.
this isn't war. But I just Yeah, there's so many psychological levels that we can dive at this mentality. But at the end of the day, people make money off of this stuff. So even if you like it or hate it, they make money off of it. Um, and there are key people who perpetuate it. And listen, some of this stuff is isolated to X. Some of it goes a little bit beyond X into other areas of the online arena. But what I'm concerned with is that influential people actually within politics listen to these people, listen to these large accounts and highlight them and give them credence. So that's my concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. These are some very good observations. Absolutely. So I want to go back to an article you wrote a few years ago, changing
Mhm.
topics a little bit. In 2022, you wrote an article titled, quote, "The mainstream media lied to me about conservatives." And so this year, there's been a lot of talk about how some African Americans are forming a political coalition that was moving towards the right, particularly Black men in terms of
Mhm.
their voting preferences. Do you see this shift happening? And if so, do you think it's sustainable?
I do see a so I do see a shift, but I don't think it's for the reasons that people think it's for. So I think there are more people who are open for voting for Trump than becoming Republicans. And I think there's a distinction between the two.
Interesting.
Um, I think that because actually, I mean, it hasn't been published yet, and it might be published, but I interviewed 6 or 7 people who are out in Georgia, and I was asking them these questions. They were Black Americans, and I asked them a series of questions, but like the most important question is, have you decided who you're voting for? Um, and amongst your friends, uh, and friends and family, like where were they leaning towards? And some of them said they're mixed. Some of them were decided, like as far as who they were voting for. But no matter what answer they gave for themselves, they all said that their friends and families are mixed. And I said, that's very interesting because the way things are portrayed is like, oh no, every single Black person, Democrat, yeah, of course, of course. But the fact that they were mixed. Now, I will say, when I conducted the interview, Joe Biden was running for office, so they were mixed up mostly on Joe Biden. Um, and so it wasn't a love for Trump, but it was more a dissatisfaction with Joe Biden. So I think I think we should really see what those poll numbers look like once a nominee has actually been selected. Um, so we'll see about that. But I think if someone's thinking that 40% of Black Americans are going to start voting Republican moving forward, they're going to be very disappointed. If you say that Trump is going to have a record Black voter turnout this election, um, and topple what he did previously, um, I think that's probably going to happen. Um, but that's not saying too much. I can't remember what percentage he got before. Um, but there is this idea that Democrats own Black people. So if they don't get more than was it like 96%, they're like, we're losing them. So we'll
Yeah.
we'll see what happens. But I think it'll probably be somewhere around 12, 13% um uh Black voters voting for Trump.
That's substantial. That's very substantial. And if you look
Yeah.
at the history of political demographics, and I mean, this is probably the age-old question. You probably get to ask this a lot, but I myself am conflicted on what the answer is. Why do you think
Mhm.
so many Black people for so long have voted Democrat, despite the fact that some of our most cherished civil rights icons like MLK were not Democrats? It's just really interesting to me. I don't know the answer to it. I think part of it has to do with habit. Generations after generation just follow what the previous generation did. I think that's part of it is. I think the other
Mhm.
part of it just has to do with the fact that I guess people associate the civil rights movement with the Democratic Party because it was LBJ, a Democrat, that signed the Civil Rights Act. But I don't think it's as conscious for a lot of people. I think it's just follow the leader. But what do you think?
So one I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying, but I want to add on, and I think this is actually a really, really big thing. Um, Demographics and choice. Because so we'll start with demographics. 60% of Black Americans live in 10 states. You can name those states by the large cities within these states. So Illinois, you have Chicago, Georgia, you have Atlanta, so on and so forth. So within these states, they primarily live in or in the surrounding metropolitan areas within these states. So when you have that and you look within these particular areas, and if you just look on the political party, how many times do you look in these particular cities where they live at? Do you see Republicans fighting for their vote? Now you can say, well, that's just today. But if you go back and go back and go back, you'll see that actually there hasn't been a whole lot of competition for their vote. Not even just Black Americans, because there's all different types of people living within cities, but just within those cities. So if you look at Chicago, I know they have like unaffiliated races, but Chicago hasn't had a Republican mayor since the early 1900s. New Orleans hasn't had a Republican mayor since the 1800s. That's pretty much the pattern all the way around, except for maybe like New York City, which the last Republican mayor, I guess you can say was Bloomberg, although he switched parties like twice. But you had Giuliani, you had Bloomberg. So for the most part, there hasn't been a whole lot of competition coming from the Republican Party within major cities in this country. And that's not a new thing. That's something that's been repeated generation after generation. So then it becomes, do Black people even know Republicans, like on a personal relationship? Do they know Republicans, or Republicans reaching out to them? Do they even know what the Republican platform is? Now you add in a whole media apparatus that has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. You add in social media. So every person who lives in these particular areas, what they know about Republicans is from a distance. So for them, a Republican is Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? But Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't live anywhere near New York City, right? And they're getting that is from sound bites and stuff like that. So it's not appealing to try to gravitate towards someone that you have no idea what about. And then you have a left-wing filter that says, oh, well, they're bad people and they're racist. Well, that's their bias. But what have they actually said? What do they actually believe? What are they advocating for? So I think it's a combination of the two. You have, well, actually three, because you brought up the culture. So culturally speaking, just like Republicans, if you live in a rural area, your parents were Republicans, your grandparents were Republicans, so on and so forth, that becomes kind of like the default. It's a cultural thing, it's normal. But then on top of that, you don't have competition coming from the other party, just like in rural areas, they don't have a whole lot of competition coming from both parties. So much of our country is not competed for from both political parties. It's bad enough that we only have two competent, I say competent, but two like political parties that are vying for people's votes. But it's actually worse if you look locally, because there's really generally one political party in a given region that is vying for people's votes. In certain spots, there are two, but in many areas, especially in the cities, the real election is actually the primary for the Democratic Party. So I think that's a much, much bigger thing. Black Americans live in very particular places. These particular places, whether they're majority Black or not majority Black, they're large cities, and Republicans aren't actually there to compete for their vote, and they haven't been for generations. So these Black voters don't know or understand or have never even met a Republican in person. So I think that is a much, much bigger thing. So that's why when people say, oh, the Black vote is, they're moving over Republicans, why would they do that? Right? They
Yeah.
know Trump from a distance, and they know who he is, and he has name recognition. And all right, fine, you can get maybe 5% people more to vote for Trump than maybe prior. But the idea that you're all of a sudden going to get dissatisfied Democrats to go over to leave the devil they know to go over to the devil that they don't know, I think is unrealistic. I think, and this is like a long generational challenge that if Republicans actually want to do, Republicans have to win cities. Like that would be the biggest game changer for Republicans. But I think, call me conspiratorial, but I think there's no real interest in trying to win cities. They want guarantee wins in areas that are uh, either in their favor or winnable, but they don't want the prospect of investing time and effort in local things in areas that they don't traditionally win. And so if you have that mentality year after year after year, generation after generation, nothing's going to change. And we've seen that for almost 100 years.
Very interesting. That's a very compelling explanation, and that makes a lot of sense too. Hopefully, it'll enlighten a lot of people as well. Well,
Yeah.
Adam, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to promote or say before we leave?
Yeah, I mean, check out my Substack, adambcoleman.substack.com, and check out my video series, Breaking Bread, sitting down, it's in person only, sitting down with people, having a meal, and just talking culture, politics. I have a bit of a travel element too, so sometimes people come to my house, sometimes I go to them in various states. I've gone to London twice with Breaking Bread. And it's been quite an experience over the past year. So yeah, check it out.
It's wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Adam, and everyone else. Have a nice day.